So this is day 3 of the archaeological dig at Bremenium Roman Fort. We're making excellent progress already. This is our trench that we call Trench 4, and we've got this very long revetment wall. There's some overlap of this that we exposed last year, but we're chasing it back, and it is interesting. We have the return of it here going up into the section, which we shall be machining back to see its full extent. But it looks like there may be a platform on here. Pardon the wind, it's not easy conditions. But there's flat cobblestones on there in a square leading on to smaller metalling, and it's obviously some kind of platform. We're not sure yet, we'll keep going. Lots of pottery coming out of it, and then on the other side of it, just appearing, are some other footings of sorts in here. Could be another structure. So we need to machine that back and have a better look. But right now, we're very lucky to be joined by Professor Jim Crow, who will be giving us a site tour for the broader Bremenium site.
Edinburgh and formerly at Newcastle University. And whilst at Newcastle University, excavated here for 6-7 seasons between 1992 and 1998. And basically everything that we're now doing follows on from, and this is a direct continuation from that project. That's where I see it anyway.
Well, the real difference is that Richard can dig. It's not like I can't dig, because I spent part of my career before that excavating Hadrian's Wall. But Richard spends his life digging, and so he knows much better than I did, and certainly we did with our students then, to be well, we were encouraged to do. We weren't encouraged to excavate on this scale. So it's really brilliant what has been achieved over the last five years with Bob and Richard and co, and so it's really impressive, and it's really a question of trying to put it all together. So I'll just say something about the background of the fort. I am, incidentally, not only did I lecture at Newcastle from 1990 until 2007, I'm also a graduate, but never mind, that's a long time, that's a very long time ago. Right, so High Rochester Roman Fort. It's one of the most important forts in Roman Britain, because for a significant amount of time, in terms of the Roman occupation of Britain, it was the most northerly fort, north of Hadrian's Wall. There were, of course, as you'll be familiar with, there were times when the Romans occupied parts of Scotland, but they never occupied Scotland for any significant length of time, more than a decade or 2 decades in the case of the Antonine War. And so when High Rochester was occupied, it really was almost out on a limb. The only other sites to the north of here, which are just into Scotland, are Newstead, which is near Melrose on the River Tweed, where there's another equally interesting and amazing fort. Only that was excavated at the very end or the very beginning of the 20th century, but much more extensively than there have been excavations in the interior here. And there are remarkable finds, which you'll see in the National Museum of Scotland, relating to Newstead. But this site has, not only is it one of the most remarkable forts in terms of its situation, it's actually the first fort, I'm always slightly out on a limb here, it's the first fort ever completely excavated, almost completely excavated in the interior, to give a plan of the interior of a Roman fort anywhere in the Roman world, because it was excavated in the 1850s. First of all sponsored by the Duke of Northumberland, and secondly by the Society of Antiquities in Newcastle on Tyne. And those excavation reports are really important, and on the basis of those, there is an almost complete plan of the interior. And one of the really interesting things that we were allowed to do was to do very limited excavations in the interior. Obviously, that's a scheduled site. But English Heritage allowed us to do, Historic England, whatever they are, allowed us to do limited excavations. And we were able to demonstrate that the 19th century plan is pretty bang on, it's pretty accurate. And so we were able to then integrate the 19th century plan to the surveys, because we did a great deal of surveying. And of course, I'm talking about 25 years ago, and at that time, we didn't have the advantages of LiDAR. Now you just do a LiDAR survey and you'll be able to put it all together, and some clever clogs on a computer could put it all together in about half an hour. But anyway, it took us much longer. So students were surveying and doing all sorts of things like that, quite different from the way you might approach the site today. So what sort of site is it? It's first, as far as we can tell, it's first occupied in what we call the Flavian period. You'll be aware of that. In other words, in the later part of the 1st century AD, when the Romans are moving into Scotland and in the campaigns of Agricola, which end up with the legionary fortress up at the Tooth Hill, up on the Tay. That's a long way into Scotland. But of course, as I'm sure you're familiar, the Romans only held that for perhaps a decade, perhaps less, and then they withdrew back into what's the southern part of Scotland and northern England. I'm not going into the complexities of that. So this fort at that stage was on the line of the most important Roman road in the north of Britain, which is Deer Street, and that's the A68. Now the road, now the roads lead to Newcastle, but this road, if you follow it south, then it branches off, and then it goes down to Corbridge on the crossing of the Roman crossing of the Tyne. So, and this road, Corbridge, leading back to York through County Durham, and then in leading north up to Newstead, and then up to the Firth of Forth. So this is the great route linking the northern part of the Roman province of Britain at various stages. And so in the Flavian period, then, it's essentially a road fort along that line. Very limited excavations here, and it's important to recognise that there have been excavations, and we re-excavated Ian Richmond's trenches at the northwestern corner there, and we were able to more or less confirm what he'd found, that there is a turf and timber fort, probably. It will be nice to get more evidence of that, but for the moment I'm not going to try and upset the apple cart so far. Remember also that Richmond was professor. He was at Newcastle from 1932 until 1956. He was professor. He was one of the most eminent Roman archaeologists of his time, and then he went to Oxford. So Richmond worked here, and if you're interested in this region, what still remains the best account is to be found in volume 15 of the Northumberland County History, called The Romans in Redesdale. It's a big chunky chapter by Richmond, and on that was the occasion when he carried out limited excavations, and Richmond could dig a trench so narrow you can hardly fit in it and come up with a conclusion so grand you might question it, but never mind. He used to write a narrative on the basis of very small trenches. At the same time, he put all the evidence together, so that he put all the evidence for all of the rich collection of carved stones and inscriptions which are from the fort. And it's also worth remembering that the Great North Museum collection, if you go around it carefully and you look at where the stones actually come from, most of them don't come from Hadrian's Wall at all. They come from Redesdale. They either come from High Rochester or back southwards at the next fort to the south. There's an awful lot of stones there, really impressive stones, including, you must all know, the three ladies who seem to have lost their clothes on a day like this. It's quite acceptable, but most days in Northumberland it's not really acceptable. It may be Venus and two nymphs. It's a wonderful carving. It's in the Great North Museum. That comes from High Rochester. Okay, so fantastic collection of inscriptions, fantastic collections of carved stones, also artifacts which are now in Alnwick Castle Museum. So that's from the 1850s excavations, Richmond's excavations, and then the work that we did. Now, why should we do work? Why were we invited by the Northumberland National Park and what was then English Heritage to do work here? Well, basically, I think it was to try and, it was at a time when there was a little bit more money, and the National Park had recognised this was a site of some interest within the National Park, in addition to Hadrian's Wall. So they decided that what we should do is to use what was then the most advanced techniques, which was geophysics, so a resistivity survey and a magnetometer survey of the whole of the area around the fort. So there we know the fort, and you'll notice how the fort's on this fantastic platform, and that's because the fort has built up like a Near Eastern tell or huyuk over generations, from the Flavian period right up into the probably early 4th century. So what the National Park and English Heritage funded then was a massive geophysical survey in all of this field here, and in the fields to the east, and in the fields to the south. Geophysical surveys have been carried out subsequently, and Richard will be the I mean, we'll happily agree that despite the fact that new geophysical surveys were carried out in the, there was Biggins and Co.
2004.
There was 2004.
2021.
Yeah, 2021. They're all exactly the same, spot on.
The best one was
Yeah,
1992.
yeah, the 1992, 1993, they're the best ones. So it just shows you that in some areas technology does change and improve, but in some areas technology doesn't so much. So what those geophysical surveys demonstrated was that there was a busy life outside of the confines of the fort. So within the fort, we have the standard headquarters building, barracks or accommodation for the soldiers, commanding officer's house, 2 sets of granaries, not just 2 granaries like housesteads, but 4 granaries side by side because its situation. But then outside, the geophysics showed us there was a lot happening. It was very busy in this field here, and we weren't sure. And this is where I'm quite prepared to admit my errors. I didn't think there was actually very much significant on the field to the east, which is where the Roman road passes the fort and it's heading northwards up into the hills over there. Now, what we were looking for on the east side would have been some sort of roadside settlement, which is well documented in a number of forts in northern Britain, particularly Old Penrith, Old Carlisle rather. There's a site called Old Carlisle where it can be seen very clearly from air photography and also from LiDAR. So you have a Roman road and you have buildings alongside it. And this is akin to a vicus. So as a consequence of we did some excavations in that field over there, but as I say, I perhaps didn't have the energy, or the students weren't busy enough, but we didn't really find anything very significant on that east side associated with the road. So there was clearly Roman activity out that side, but nothing to demonstrate that there'd been this roadside settlement as is known elsewhere. And I put this down to the fact that we're actually north of Hadrian's Wall, and that, like all the other of the outpost forts, of which there are 4 altogether, 2 over to the west and 2 on this side, that none of the outpost forts have got actual civil settlements, the vici, like you find, for instance, at Burdolsford or Housesteads and so forth. So over there, although the geophysics and the excavation didn't seem to confirm a settlement, I then looked again, I think it was last year, going through some of my files, paper files, and I looked at a much higher resolution geophysics from over there, and I thought, blast. I didn't say that, but I said blast. It was clear evidence for, it looks just like the sort of beaky along the strip houses you see alongside a road. And I showed this to Richard, and I said, as one of the old lecturers in Newcastle used to say, there's a rabbit away. So therefore, that's why I hope you'll be able to do some properly targeted excavation in that field over there. So that's really actually very important. But on this side, there were all sorts of features emerged from the geophysics. I mean, really interesting set of features in terms of ditches and banks and some evidence for buildings. But as I say, in the 90s, we actually didn't do a great deal of excavation. We did very limited excavation in this field. So I was very pleased when Richard came back 5 years ago and initiated a series of excavations here, which were able to test for what was actually apparent or not apparent in the geophysics. Because although some of those features are apparent in geophysics, an awful lot of the features that are on that are not apparent in the geophysics, are they? Yeah, and it's just an indication of what geophysics can tell you. And you know, the time team and all that are always going on about the wonders of geophysics. But geophysics will tell you something, but it's only part of the picture. And excavation will make it even more complicated. And so that's why excavation here, whether this is the final year or but certainly for this year, I mean, it has the opportunity then to actually sort of clarify what's happening in this part of the fort. Now, my view, and I think Richard probably agrees with me, is that none of the structures that have been discovered in the fort, in this area here, within these banked enclosures, are reflective of what we might call a vicus, a civil settlement. as the examples I've already cited from Hadrian's Wall or from Maryport. Down the coast. So I'm not convinced that this is a vicus. I prefer to call this an annex, and that's on comparison with what we find on the Antonine Wall, where there are banked enclosures associated with the forts. Although on the Antonine Wall, the forts themselves are actually, the majority of them are much smaller than this, but so I don't want to get too close to that. So the fort that you see it today, the stone fort, belongs probably to that Antonine period when the Romans, having completed Hadrian's Wall, put all their forts along the line of the wall, all the soldiers are all easing up, sitting on their deck chairs on a nice day, and then Hadrian dies, and they say, oh, so and so. And then a new emperor comes along, and shortly afterwards he decides to, as an expression of his power, to move northwards into Scotland, and then to establish a new linear barrier between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde, which we know as the Antonine Wall. And there's lots of evidence for the Antonine Wall. There's lots of inscriptions, well, some inscriptions. And that's when this fort then, as far as we can tell, was then reconstructed in stone. So it was built in the 1st century, then probably abandoned. There hasn't been enough excavation to say one thing or the other, but I guess it was abandoned probably at the time of the occupation of Hadrian's Wall, the initial occupation of Hadrian's Wall, and then it was reoccupied as a road fort in this country for the main Roman route running up to the Antonine Wall. So that's the chronology. The stonework that you see today, however, belongs to a later period, and it belongs to, and there are a number of inscriptions associated with that, and that's to do with the Emperor Septimius Severus. Septimius Severus was an emperor around about 200 AD, or just before 200 and just after. He died on campaign in Britain with his 2 sons, who were a pair of quarrelsome so-and-sos. And he brought a large army into the north of Britain and extended a series of campaigns right into the north of Scotland, beyond Aberdeen. So we can be pretty confident, we can be reasonably confident that if Septimius Severus didn't take the sea route, he must have passed through High Rochester. So there must have been a time when all of these fields, and of course you're probably familiar that if you look across those fields over there, beyond that electricity pylon, on the other side of the burn, you can see the outline of these temporary camps. And of course, the temporary camps in this part of Northumberland and in Scotland are a remarkable preservation of what we call temporary camps or marching camps. But you can imagine, if Septimius was here, that whole landscape would be covered in tentage of legions. And it must have been the most extraordinary sight, because there's several legions involved, all the auxiliaries, really remarkable. And then they marched northwards into Scotland. And there's another place a bit like this, which has more of these large camps associated with it, called Ardogh, which is a great Roman fort. It's not stone, but it's earthworks in Perthshire. And you can see that they were there as well. And then there's like footprints. They all march up the east side of Scotland, these marching camps. But there's a sort of slight problem, and I won't go into the sort of interpretive issues, but we also know that in exactly the same period as Severus is campaigning into Scotland, he's also, and his successors are undertaking a massive program of rebuilding at many of the forts. And this is one of the forts that was reconstructed. And there are inscriptions from that period talking about the reconstruction, and further down Deer Street in that direction there at Habitancum. So on the one hand, we have a massive program of building, and also a period of massive expansion, or a punitive invasion, because the Romans didn't stay. They went up there, they probably killed a lot of people, or tried to kill a lot of people, those who didn't disappear into the mountains and the forests, and then they came back down again. Severus died, and then the Roman Empire started to fragment. But we'll have a look at the gate in a second. But one of the most spectacular finds, certainly as I'm concerned, because I'm an archaeologist who likes stones. Basically, I like buildings. I spent 8 years or something excavating Hadrian's Wall, near where that unfortunate tree was at Sycamore Gap, and So I like walls and stones, and that's very much the sort of archaeology I do. But one of the really exciting things that they discovered just over there, it's now under turf again, was one of the very few examples of a lime kiln. And these walls that you see them, of course, would have not been dry stone like the dry stone field walls. They would have been bonded with lime mortar. And there's a brilliant example of a Roman lime kiln, which was found over 2 seasons just over there. And it's constructed into the pre-existing bank, so it's a latish feature. So my guess, I know Richard thinks about this, my guess is it belongs to this program of rebuilding the fort under Severus.
We've got no dating evidence.
You've got no dating evidence, so my speculation is absolutely correct in that case. Good old-fashioned, but on the basis of the very fact that it's cut into the earlier features suggests that it's a later structure. But if we walk over to the gateway, this is the
In the
Mm.
beautiful, isn't it? It's like
Yeah.
a lawn coming up.
I know.
The whole thing is beautifully exposed and presented.
I know. What's that? Malcolm. Richard, shall we go through this or not? Yeah. I don't mind going through it. There used to be an arrangement with the National Park that they would. If any of you are in shorts, you might be a bit anxious about the nettles, but
If any of you are in sandals, you shouldn't be in sandals anyway.
no, you shouldn't be in sandals. It's against health and safety.
Yeah.
You may have to do this in 2 groups. I'll speak, you can all hear me. But at the same time, this is one amongst the best preserved examples of a gateway on Hadrian's Wall or within the Northumberland, the Roman buildings in Northumberland. It was excavated in the 1850s, and there's a very good drawing in the collection at South Shields. This decorated stone and this one represent the springing of the arch, which means, and the Romans were not, I mean, they were probably a bit shorter than me. They were probably about that. But in other words, the road surface is quite a lot lower down than where I'm standing here. And that gives you some idea of the build-up of material. The other thing that's very interesting is that you can see this blocking wall. And for a long time, I was not really sure how much of that blocking wall was Roman or basically a Victorian and subsequent feature. But again, this drawing from the South Shields Museum shows the blocking in position. In other words, the gateway was blocked. And you can immediately recognize the significance of that because all the busyness that's happening out here in these fields, in this annex, in this sequence of annexes, once you've blocked this gate, you can't access it. So it means that at a certain period, this gate was blocked and this area out here was abandoned. Unfortunately, we don't know the evidence of that, but maybe as a consequence of a study of the ceramics found over that area, we might be able to get a terminus date or any other material. We haven't got that many coins, have we? No, but we got, the ceramics is not bad. And there's a sufficient range of ceramics to be able to get, indication of date, to indicate when that happens. So if this is Severn, which means it's around about 200 to 10 AD, and this is a new gate, and it's a very distinctive form of gateway. It's not like the gates on Hadrian's Wall. It's not like Housted's or Bed Oswald or some of the others, or you see reconstructed, for instance, at South Shields. In fact, there is enough evidence from early photographs from Richmond to suggest that there was an earlier gate here, which was just like the gateway at South Shields. In other words, two archways, double portal. But this is a single portal. It's different and it's slightly projecting, and everything about it shows the way that times were changing and patterns were changing from the standard forms from the from the Hadrianic and the Antonine period, and then at the end of the second into the third century, patterns are changing. Nothing so much as if you go down to the fort down at West Woodburn, where is actually a projecting tower known from earlier excavations, but unfortunately there's nothing that can be seen. That's a remarkable feature. Now, the mortar in here, I would reckon that that's Roman mortar, and that should be the mortar that was made in the lime kiln just along there. So this represents this restoration phase in the early part of the 3rd century. So here we have it, and very distinctive, and then a single stone arch with a big gates inside. There's lots of stonework. I mean, there's various plans going back to the 19th century suggesting there were big towers over this gate on this side. So originally, both the predecessor gate and this gate allowed access into this area here where you're excavating, or some of you are excavating, and then much later on, and that's what we don't know, the gateway itself would have been blocked. My guess, these stones here are more or less original in their position, but I'd need to see it all cleaned off and all the rest of it, whether there's any mortar or anything surviving in it. But as I say, the actual drawing is a really good drawing, and there are drawings, and then there are other phases of construction which are too detailed to bother to go into now. So this gateway is very important. Shall we go on to the fort? And I'll say a little bit about the organisation of the fort. Richard, what do we? You've talked about what's happening at the headquarters building. The gate is just through the trees there. So there's a roadway running through there, basically to where that farm gate is, and that's the east gate of the fort. And then there's a north gate through there, and the headquarters building is under this grass here. And as I say, in, I don't know, 97 or 96 or maybe 95, we excavated where we expected it to be according to the 19th century plan, and we got it spot on. It was amazing. So we're obviously on the east side of the fort, and over the last, this is the first time that there's been any attempt to excavate in this field, and it's potentially slightly more problematic. It had to be done much more carefully than in the field over there. But the line of the Roman road is coming from the south. Remember that on Petty Knowes, on the knoll to the south of here, is one of a really well preserved Roman cemetery. And some of the Roman cemetery consists of circular stone tombs. There were more. One of them was robbed out in the 19th century, but they're actually really impressive stone tombs. And they're probably officers' tombs or something like that. And they're comparable to other examples of tombs elsewhere in the Roman world. And they're on the high ground beside the Roman road, just as you have the Roman roads leading into Rome itself, are lined by cemeteries and tombs. So Deer Street is lined as you get close to the fort. The other, perhaps in some ways more interesting aspect is that there was also a small mound with a series of slight tumuli, and those were excavated by Beryl Charlton, who lived in the house just over there, on the closest to the fort wall on the far side, for many years. And she was an archaeologist, and she worked with Northumberland National Park and with the Ministry of Defence in the ranges. And she excavated those, and that's published. And there she found a whole series of cremation burials. So those are the sort of standard burials from the late 2nd and into the 3rd century. So that's very much for the Antonine period plus, or it could be earlier. It could go into the Hadrianic, but they tend to be cremation burials tend to be earlier. Cremation burials in pots, and quite a few of those have been more recently found. For instance, at Bird Oswald, and also on the Cumberland coast, and they're quite common now. But at the time when Beryl did those, there are actually fewer of those were known. So graveyards at the top there. The other thing that's coming from the south, because on the high ground, was the line of an aqueduct channel. That was reported in the 19th century, and then it appeared on the Geophysics, the first Geophysics survey, and you can see it from the Geophysics coming into the fort at the south gate. So that was a channel of water. And whether they're from that channel, from other water channels, you know, the little house on the corner, I mean, I know you walk up in a different way, but if you take the road back down to the main road, and there's this little annex on the corner, which is constructed of the stones, the decorated stones that were found in the mid 19th century excavations, and many of those have got channels in, scoops, in other words, to allow water to flow. So there's a water system, and that's coming in that way. Now that raises the question of where were the bars, because we know that Roman garrisons had bars. In fact, there are no bars actually well attested outside of the fort, or there are some bars actually attested in the southwest corner, but they're not the full-size bars that you might find in a fort, such as have been excavated at Wallsend or at Chester's and elsewhere. So bars are an issue here. Whether there was a big set of extramural bars, we don't know. They simply have not emerged from the geophysical survey. So that's an interesting problem. Where were the bars? So it's very interesting what careful but resolute excavation here, what it might recover in terms of both the road and what can be associated with the road in terms of the potential of strip dwellings of the type that you find along the line of Roman roads that I've already mentioned, and that we didn't discover in 1994 or 5, whatever it was we were digging here. So you could achieve what an earlier bunch of Newcastle students didn't, you see, by careful and stalwart digging. So I hope you're able to get something out of this. Is there anything else I should cover? When you look back, you can once again recognize the way that the fort is a real fort platform, which has accumulated over time. See, it's standing up. Originally, this field would have just gone straight through. The fort would have been here from Flavian times and then gradually built up.
Any temples and altars or anything?
There are quite a few altars, but there are no specific temples that I'm aware of. I mean, presumably those nymphs must be associated either with a spring, or they might be associated with a water feature, or they might be associated with a temple. There's a dedication to, it's not actually Mithras directly, but it suggests there was a Mithraeum. But none of these things have been, actually ever since the excavations at Vindolanda a few years ago, where they actually found a temple inside the fort, the old premise that all temples were outside the fort and you only just did basic, ordinary daily life inside the fort has gone out the window. So there presumably were temples, and there were temples, certainly attested from a number of inscriptions, but where they're located is not clear. Okay. And some of the people here were really, there's one inscription which is very difficult to read. It's in Elsdon, which is, if you go back down the A68 and then turn off to the left, it's a village there. And it's in the church, and it's a big stone, and it's a gravestone to the commanding officer. And it's set up by his wife. Well, we know that commanding officers had their wives, but her status in Roman society was very, she wasn't just equestrian, she was senatorial in rank. She was clarissima, of the most brilliant. That was her title in giving her status. So she was a sort of marchioness or something in Roman terms. And so she was married to this chap who died in service, and he'd had all sorts of jobs, including looking after the Roman roads in parts of Italy. So roads, it's partly communications and partly security beyond the wall. That's the purpose of this site throughout its history. Right, at that point, I shall allow you to get back to your trenches. Right, okay, sit back down. Another 25 minutes. The network of roads here, of course, the other thing which this is for is important is that we knew from previous studies and very clearly from the geophysical survey in this area here that there is a link road which runs off in this direction here over the hills towards Coquetdale, and sorry. And oh yeah, it goes over to what's called the Devil's Causeway, which is a Roman road which runs up from north of Corbridge up towards Tweedmouth. In other words, the mouth of the Tweed, basically where I live. I live on the other side of the Tweed. So that Roman road, but the evidence for its occupation is much shorter than for High Rochester. And there is one known fort. There are a number of other Roman installations, but there's a fort, Low Learchild, which has at least 2 phases, but it's never built in stone. It's only ever built in turf and timber.